The dry season had lingered longer than usual in the eastern lands. The red earth cracked beneath the feet of hunters and farmers alike, and rivers thinned to narrow streams. In one Igbo village near the great river Niger, men sat beneath the udala tree debating how to find more salt, cloth, and metal tools. The women had begun to complain that the earthen pots were breaking too quickly, and the men who smoked fish wished for new knives to make their work easier. Among those who listened to the debate was a young man named Obinna. He was known for his restless spirit and curiosity about lands beyond his own. While others were content with farming yam and tending goats, Obinna longed for travel, for stories of other tongues and other people. When elders announced that a trading party would cross the great river in search of markets, he volunteered without hesitation. For days they prepared. They packed woven baskets with palm oil sealed in calabashes, dried fish smoked over irako wood, and tubers of yam. Cowries jingled in goatskin pouches, the currency of exchange, and charms were tied around their necks for protection. With songs and prayers, the party set off toward the river, their bare feet raising dust along the winding path. The Niger lay before them like a wide snake glistening under the sun. Its waters rolled gently, yet with power. Canoes carved from single logs waited at the banks, tended by ferrymen whose skill was as old as memory. The men pushed their baskets into the boats, and the ferrymen paddled with strong arms, cutting across the current. The village women stood at the shore, waving and singing farewell songs, their voices carrying across the water. On the other side, they stepped onto a land that felt at once familiar and strange. The trees were the same, the tall palms, the thick raffia, the whispering bamboo, but the air seemed to hum with different spirits. Paths stretched westward, and rumors told of people there who dressed in fine cloth, who built towns with walls, and who gathered in great marketplaces that never seemed to sleep. For 2 days they walked, guided by hunters who claimed to know the way. The sun baked their backs, and at night they gathered around small fires, whispering of what awaited them. Obinna's heart pounded with excitement. On the 3rd day, their journey brought them to the edge of a clearing where smoke curled into the sky. The air carried the smell of roasting yam and something spiced, richer than what Obinna knew. He crouched low, peering through the leaves. What he saw filled him with wonder. Before him lay a village unlike his own. Huts were arranged neatly, and in the center stood a larger building, adorned with carvings. Women moved gracefully with water pots balanced on their heads, their wrappers woven in patterns of blue and white. Men with broad shoulders and cower-studded hair combs sat in groups, talking in a language Obinna had never heard. The words rose and fell like drumbeats, strange yet musical. One of the Igbo traders whispered, "These must be the people the elders spoke of the Yoruba." They stepped out from the trees, carrying their baskets. The Yoruba men noticed them instantly. Silence fell in the compound. Eyes widened. Hands reached for cutlasses and spears. Children darted behind their mothers. For a moment, both groups stared at one another, caught between curiosity and fear. The Yoruba leader, a tall man with beads around his neck, stood up and spoke. His voice was deep and commanding, yet the words meant nothing to Obinna's ears. The Igbo leader responded in his own tongue, his hands raised in peace, but again the words meant nothing to the Yoruba. Confusion thickened like smoke. The Yoruba men stepped closer, their eyes sharp. One pointed at the baskets the Igbo carried. Another gestured to the strangers' bodies, their scarification marks different from their own. Obinna felt his pulse quicken. Would this be the end of their journey, cut short by misunderstanding? Then something happened, small, yet powerful. One of the Igbo men opened his basket and drew out a calabash of palm oil. He lifted it high, then set it gently on the ground before the Yoruba, pushing it forward with both hands. His gesture was clear, an offering, a trade, not a threat. The Yoruba leader frowned at first, then crouched to study the oil. He lifted it, shook it, and opened the lid. The golden liquid glistened in the sun. Slowly, his face softened. He turned to his people, said a few words, and they laughed. The tension broke. In return, the Yoruba leader reached into his compound and brought out a bundle of cloth, indigo-dyed and patterned with lines that danced like rivers. He spread it before the Igbo traders. The beauty of it drew gasps. Though not a single word was understood, both sides recognized the language of trade. What followed was awkward, clumsy, even comical at times. When an Igbo man tried to show how much dried fish equaled one strip of cloth, the Yoruba thought he was insulting them by waving fish too close to their faces. Laughter erupted when one Yoruba woman, curious, tied an Igbo man's red cap on her head and began to dance, mimicking his gait. Children giggled, elders smiled, and the stiffness melted away. Still, communication was a trial. They relied on pointing, hand signs, and imitation. One Yoruba boy drew circles in the dust to show the number of yam tubers he wanted. The Igbo replied by stacking them in matching rows. When confusion arose, both groups raised their hands in exasperation, only to burst into laughter again. By evening, the clearing had transformed. Smoke from cooking fires mingled with the smell of palm oil sizzling in iron pots. Igbo and Yoruba alike sat together, though each spoke in their own tongue, the words flowing past one another like two rivers running side by side. Yet somehow, meaning carried itself in smiles, in the breaking of kola nuts, in the shared rhythm of drums that began to beat as the night deepened. Obinna sat close to the fire, his eyes wide as he watched a Yoruba drummer strike patterns unlike those he knew. The sound seemed to call spirits from the air, to speak a language beyond words. Without thinking, he picked up a small wooden stick and began tapping on an empty calabash, matching the rhythm. The Yoruba laughed and clapped, delighted by his boldness. In that moment, the barrier of language seemed smaller. They were simply people hungry, curious, alive sharing food, music, and fire. But beneath the laughter lay questions. Who were these strangers truly? Could they be trusted? Would this meeting bring wealth or trouble? Neither side knew the answers, but both felt that something important had begun. As stars burned above the clearing, Obinna leaned back and thought, "Today, I have seen another world. A world that speaks not with my tongue, yet speaks all the same. If we return, perhaps we will learn more." And deep within, he knew this was only the beginning. Morning crept into the clearing, soft and golden, as roosters crowed on both sides of the camp. Dew clung to the grass, and smoke rose gently from rekindled fires. The Igbo traders stirred from their mats, stretching stiff muscles after a night of uneasy sleep. Across from them, the Yoruba villagers were already busy, women grinding grain on flat stones, men sharpening tools, children running with laughter that pierced the quiet dawn. Obinna rubbed his eyes and gazed at the scene. It felt surreal to him. Only yesterday, these people were strangers armed with suspicion. Today, they moved around them with curiosity instead of fear. Yet the barrier of language still hung heavy, like a thick wall no one knew how to climb. The first challenge came with breakfast. The Igbo brought out smoked fish wrapped in leaves and roasted yam from their baskets. A Yoruba woman approached, balancing a pot of steaming food. She ladled out a spicy stew, its scent sharp and unfamiliar, and placed it before them. She spoke, her words a string of sounds Obinna could not follow. The Igbo leader, Okeke, smiled politely and nodded. He pointed at the food, then at his mouth, trying to ask if it was for eating. The Yoruba woman frowned, tilted her head, then burst into laughter. She replied in her tongue, waving her hand as though shooing away a fly. The Igbo men exchanged puzzled glances. Finally, Obinna reached forward, scooped a small portion with a piece of yam, and put it into his mouth. The taste exploded hot pepper, ground seeds, and palm oil. His eyes watered, and he coughed violently. The Yoruba woman clapped her hands and laughed so hard she bent over. Soon, others joined, chuckling at the stranger's tears. Obinna wiped his eyes, grinning despite the burn. "Hot like fire," he muttered in Igbo, though no one understood. Food became their first lesson. The Yoruba realized the Igbo were not rejecting them, but simply unused to their spice. To bridge the gap, they pointed at the stew, saying, "Obey." The Igbo repeated clumsily, "Obey." Then the Yoruba pointed at the yam, saying, "Isu." Again, the Igbo repeated. Laughter followed each attempt, but slowly, words began to slip into memory. The day moved into trade. The Yoruba brought out goods, dyed cloth, beads, carved wooden stools, and iron tools. The Igbo laid out palm oil, dried fish, and baskets of yam. Each side eyed the other's offerings with interest, but how to agree on value? A Yoruba man picked up a strip of indigo cloth and held it against his chest, showing its beauty. He then pointed at Obinna's basket of palm oil and gestured too. But his hand signal confused the Igbo. Was he asking for 2 calabashes of oil, or offering 2 strips of cloth? Obinna responded by placing 2 fish on the ground. The Yoruba frowned, shook his head, and picked up the fish, sniffing it. He muttered words that sounded displeased. Thinking he was insulted, Obinna stiffened. The air grew tense, as other Igbo men stepped forward protectively. For a heartbeat, it seemed mistrust would undo the fragile friendship. Then, an elder Yoruba trader chuckled. He squatted on the ground, drew shapes in the dust 2 lines on one side, one circle on the other. He pointed at the lines, then at the cloth, then at the circle, and finally the calabash of oil. Slowly, the Igbo understood. He meant 2 cloths for 1 calabash. The Igbo men burst into laughter, slapping their thighs in relief. Okeke nodded and handed over the oil. The Yoruba elder gave him 2 cloths, smiling wide. A trade had been struck, the first of many. But not all attempts went smoothly. Later, a Yoruba boy tried to ask for yam. He tapped his stomach, rubbed his belly, and pointed at the Igbo basket. The Igbo thought he was sick and rushed to give him herbs. The boy's eyes widened in alarm, and he ran off, leaving the traders confused. Only after much explanation and pointing at yam did everyone laugh at the misunderstanding. Children, unbothered by pride, learned faster than adults. Yoruba children gathered around Obinna, poking his arm, asking questions in their tongue. He shrugged helplessly, but when they showed him a calabash and said Igba, he repeated after them. They clapped and cheered as though he had performed magic. Soon they taught him more. Omi for water, Al for house. Obinna, in return, taught them Miri and Yulo. Laughter echoed across the compound, as children bridged gaps their elders struggled with. Yet not all was innocent. Some Yoruba whispered suspicions were these strangers spies from distant enemies? Some Igbo worried that the Yoruba might enslave them, as stories of raids traveled far. Every gesture was weighed, every smile balanced against the possibility of betrayal. That evening, as drums began again, Obinna noticed how Yoruba men greeted one another by prostrating, lying flat in respect to elders. He nudged Okeke and whispered, "Look at how they fall to the ground. Our people bow, but never like that." Okeke grunted. They are different, but their respect is clear. A Yoruba elder noticed their watching. He motioned to Obinna to come forward. Unsure, Obinna obeyed. The elder pointed to himself, said Baba, then gestured for Obinna to repeat. Obinna said it clumsily, earning laughter from the crowd. Then the elder pointed at Obinna and said, "Omo." Again, Obinna repeated. Slowly, through patience and play, they began to weave a thin rope of understanding. But the night also brought shadows. As fires dimmed, some Igbo men whispered of their unease. We eat their food, yet we do not know their thoughts. What if tomorrow they turn on us? Others replied, We have crossed the river. We cannot return empty-handed. We must trust the gods. In the Yoruba huts, similar whispers passed. These strangers carry charms and marks we do not know. Will their spirits trouble our land? Some feared misfortune, while others, especially the younger traders, felt excitement at new opportunities. The next day brought another misunderstanding, one that nearly ended in blows. An Igbo man offered palm oil for iron tools. The Yoruba smith, proud of his craft, thought the amount too small. He shook his head firmly, waving his hand. The Igbo man misread the gesture as anger, and in his frustration he raised his voice. The Yoruba smith, thinking himself insulted, shouted back. Within moments, men on both sides had gripped their cutlasses. It was the Yoruba elder again who saved the moment. He raised both hands, stepped into the middle, and with slow gestures explained the disagreement. He showed with his fingers 3 calabashes for 1 iron tool. The Igbo leader nodded, and the trade was sealed. Afterward, the air was heavy. Obinna thought of how close they had come to fighting. He realized that without careful patience, their journey could end in blood. He swore silently to himself to learn more of these people's tongue, to make sure words never failed them again. That night, drums and flutes filled the air, and dancers whirled in circles. Though language still separated them, rhythm bound them together. Igbo and Yoruba alike clapped to the beat, their feet stamping the earth in harmony. Children laughed, women sang, and for the first time, it felt less like strangers meeting and more like 2 families learning each other's ways. As the moon rose high, Obinna sat by the fire and whispered, "We came as strangers, but perhaps in time we will stay as friends." And though he did not know it, that hope would grow stronger with every return journey, shaping the bond of 2 peoples for generations. Hello guys, thank you for watching this video till now. Please share your thoughts about the first encounter between the Igbos and the Yoruba people. We will be waiting to hear from you in the comments. Please take the time to click on the subscribe button to see more of our stories. Thank you. Let's continue with our story. The days stretched into weeks, and what began as an experiment in curiosity had become a rhythm of cautious exchange. Each morning, the Yoruba villagers laid out their goods under the great iroko tree in the center of the clearing. Indigo cloth, beads strung in bright patterns, carved stools polished with palm oil, and iron tools that gleamed in the sun. Opposite them, the Igbo traders arranged baskets of yam, bundles of smoked fish, jars of honey, and calabashes of thick palm oil. At first, the language barrier was like a wall of stone, unyielding and frustrating. But necessity, that ancient teacher, forced cracks into it. Hunger for trade pushed both groups to invent a system that neither had planned, yet both understood. It began with counting. One Yoruba elder carried smooth stones in his pouch. When he wanted to show the price of cloth, he placed 3 stones in a row and pointed at the fabric. Then he pointed at the palm oil, tapping the calabash, before pointing back to the stones. The Igbo men caught on quickly. Okeke, the leader, responded by placing 3 dried fish beside the stones, shaking his head, then adding 1 more fish. The Yoruba elder studied the offer, then nodded, sweeping the stones away. Trade was sealed. The system spread. Soon children, with their quick wit, carried pebbles and shells, using them to show numbers. When words failed, fingers and objects spoke. Gestures, too, became more refined. A hand slicing the air downward meant rejection. A palm pressed to the chest meant sincerity. Pointing with a stick instead of a finger softened the tone, showing respect. Over time, both groups laughed less at their mistakes and grew more skilled in this silent dance. Obinna, restless and sharp-eyed, became one of the first to experiment with words. He lingered near Yoruba children, mimicking their speech. When they pointed at water and said "Omi," he repeated until his tongue grew comfortable. He taught them Miri in return. The children delighted in repeating both words, chanting them like a song. Soon, Omi and Miri became shared sounds that carried across the clearing. Trade words emerged. Isu for yam, Azu for fish, Ipo for oil. They stitched fragments of each other's tongues into a patchwork language clumsy, incomplete, yet functional. But it wasn't only language that grew. Trust began to weave itself, thread by thread, through the fabric of daily exchange. One afternoon, a Yoruba blacksmith named Adigun offered a small iron knife in trade. It was sharp and strong, better than anything the Igbo carried. Okeke wanted it, but he did not have enough goods with him. He gestured, tried to explain that he would return with more palm oil on the next visit. Adigun frowned, uncertain. How could he trust a stranger's promise? Then Obinna stepped forward. He removed the red bead bracelet from his wrist, a family heirloom, blessed by his mother before he crossed the river. He placed it in Adigun's hand, pressing it firmly. The gesture was clear. This is my pledge. Adigun studied the bead, his eyes narrowing. Then slowly he nodded. The knife was handed over. When the Igbo returned weeks later with more oil, the bracelet was returned as promised. From that day on, a bond formed between the two men. Whenever Adigun forged new tools, he set one aside, knowing Obinna would come. Trust, once fragile, was learning to stand. Still, challenges remained. One evening, after a day of trading, a dispute broke out. A Yoruba trader accused an Igbo man of cheating him by watering down palm oil. The Igbo swore it was pure. Neither could explain clearly, and anger flared. Voices rose, hands tightened on cutlasses. The memory of past suspicions hung in the air like smoke. It was the women who intervened. A Yoruba woman dipped her hand into the calabash, rubbed the oil between her fingers, and nodded in satisfaction. "Ipo giddy," she said, "true oil." The Igbo women echoed, "Izia Ipo." With laughter and calm, they settled the quarrel. From then on, women played a key role in the trade. Their sharp senses and practical nature often cut through disputes that men's pride only worsened. Obinna marveled at how much had changed. He remembered the first tense day, when silence and suspicion hung over them. Now, laughter was common, and children played freely between groups. They taught each other songs, clapping games, and dances. Even when adults frowned at mistakes, the children carried the bridge forward. But Obinna also noticed the deeper differences. The Yoruba bowed low, sometimes prostrating fully before their elders, a sight that puzzled him. The Igbo showed respect differently, with kola nuts and greetings. When Obinna asked why they lay flat, Adigun simply tapped his chest and said, "Respect." Obinna nodded, realizing that though their customs differed, the heart of it was the same. One night, beneath a sky littered with stars, the group sat together by the fire. A Yoruba elder told a story, his voice deep and rhythmic. Though the Igbo could not follow the words, they watched the gestures, the expressions, the children's laughter. When he finished, Okeke rose and told an Igbo tale in return. The Yoruba could not grasp the language, but they clapped at the rhythm, enjoying the performance. It struck Obinna that stories, like trade, could pass even without words. Meaning lived in tone, in gesture, in the shared humanity of listening together. As weeks turned into moons, the system of trade language grew more refined. Certain Yoruba words slipped into Igbo tongues, while Igbo words found homes in Yoruba mouths. Soon, they did not need stones for every trade. They could bargain with a mix of speech, gestures, and trust. Markets began to grow. Travelers carried word of this strange partnership across the land. More traders arrived, drawn by the promise of cloth and iron, oil and yam. What began as a hesitant experiment was becoming a bridge between peoples. Yet, beneath the laughter and trade, questions lingered. Could this fragile friendship withstand greed? Would envy or pride or old suspicions undo it? Obinna sometimes lay awake at night, staring at the fire, wondering if tomorrow would bring harmony or conflict. But each morning, when the sun rose and the iroko tree filled with the bustle of trade, he felt hope kindle anew. For every gesture misunderstood, a new one was born. For every quarrel, a solution emerged. Slowly, painfully, beautifully, the wall of silence was crumbling. By the end of that season, Obinna could say in halting Yoruba, "Awa," or "we are friends." And when Adigun replied in Igbo, though clumsy, "Ani biundi enyi," Obinna laughed until tears filled his eyes. They had found a language not of perfection, but of persistence. A language born of trade, of trust, of human will. And though no one could see the future, in that moment, it felt like history itself was being written under the shade of the iroko tree. The trade between the Igbo and Yoruba had grown into a living rhythm, pulsing with the sounds of bargaining, laughter, and the occasional quarrel resolved with patience. But as the moons passed, it was not only goods that crossed between them. Culture itself began to seep through the cracks of language, flowing like a river that refuses to be contained. For Obinna, the first revelation came with a festival. It began one evening when Adigun, the Yoruba blacksmith, approached him with excitement in his eyes. He spoke quickly in his tongue, too fast for Obinna to follow, but then pointed to the moon, to the central compound, and mimed drumming and dancing. From the way the entire village bustled, women pounding yam, men bringing out carved masks, children stringing beads, it was clear something great was coming. That night, the Yoruba gathered under the wide sky. Fires blazed, drums pounded in layered rhythms, and flutes sang shrill melodies that carried across the clearing. Dancers emerged wearing masks carved with elaborate designs, their bodies painted in chalk and camwood. They moved in spirals, stamping their feet, arms cutting through the air. The Igbo traders watched in awe. Their own villages had masquerades, spirits embodied by dancers, but these Yoruba displays were grander, with costumes that shimmered in firelight and movements that told entire stories without a single word. Obinna leaned close to Okeke and whispered, "Their gods dance as ours do, yet in a different tongue." When the Yoruba realized the Igbo were watching silently, they beckoned them closer. A masked dancer approached Obinna, circling him with dramatic gestures. At first, Obinna froze, unsure whether it was a challenge or a blessing. But when the dancer held out a hand, Obinna laughed nervously and joined the circle. The Yoruba roared in approval. Soon, other Igbo joined, clapping and stamping their feet, blending their own rhythms with the Yoruba. In that moment, culture became a bridge. The beat of the drum spoke louder than any language. But just as the Igbo marveled at Yoruba festivals, the Yoruba were equally astonished by Igbo traditions. One evening, Okeke decided to honor their hosts with a kola nut ceremony. He brought out the nuts, split them, and spoke prayers in his tongue. "May peace reign, may the road be open, may our hands never be empty." Though the Yoruba did not understand the words, they understood the reverence. When Okeke passed them pieces of kola, they accepted with smiles. Later, they imitated the practice in their own way, raising the nut to the sky before chewing. Different hands, same heart, Obinna thought as he watched. The differences, however, were not always so easily bridged. One day, Obinna witnessed the Yoruba greeting their king, the Oba, who arrived from a nearby town. The villagers prostrated flat on the ground, even grown men pressing their bellies to the earth before him. Obinna was astonished. In his Igbo village, no man would lie flat before another, no matter how respected. Leaders were elders, chosen by the council, and respect was shown through words and gifts, not the surrender of one's body. Why do they fall to the ground? Obinna asked Adigun. Adigun placed his hand on his chest and said slowly, "Oba father." Great respect. Obinna frowned, uneasy. Yet he could not deny the dignity with which the Yoruba moved, their loyalty clear in their eyes. Later, when he explained to Okeke, the elder simply nodded. Their way is not ours. But do we not also honor our elders with kola and titles? Respect wears many clothes. Similarly, the Yoruba were puzzled by Igbo ways. When they saw Igbo men debating loudly among themselves before making a decision, they whispered among each other. Where is their king? Who speaks for them? For the Yoruba, authority was clear, flowing from the Oba down to his chiefs. The Igbo's communal debates seemed messy, even chaotic. Yet, over time, curiosity softened judgment. The Yoruba began to admire the Igbo's fierce independence, while the Igbo respected the Yoruba's discipline and order. Religion, too, sparked wonder. The Yoruba spoke of Orunmila, of Sango, of Ashin, their deities of wisdom, thunder, and river. They carried carved images, wore beads of different colors, and sang praises to their Orisa. The Igbo spoke of Chukwu, the supreme god, and of the Alusi, spirits tied to land and river. Though names and forms differed, both peoples shared reverence for forces beyond the human, for ancestors, for the unseen. One afternoon, as rain clouds gathered, Obinna and Adigun stood side by side under a palm tree. Lightning split the sky, thunder roared. Adigun lifted his arms and shouted, "Sango!" Obinna laughed and replied, "Amadioha." For a moment, both men realized they were calling upon different names for the same thunder that shook the earth. Perhaps, Obinna thought, our gods speak many tongues as we do. Even in daily life, exchanges deepened. Yoruba women taught Igbo women how to weave cloth with intricate indigo patterns. In return, Igbo women showed how to preserve fish with special smoking techniques that made it last longer. Yoruba men shared ironworking secrets, while Igbo men taught how to cultivate yam mounds that yielded more harvest. Children, as always, led the way. They played games that mixed words from both tongues, chasing each other while shouting half Igbo, half Yoruba phrases that no elder could fully follow. Their laughter carried across the clearing like music. Yet not everything was harmony. One evening, a misunderstanding arose during a ritual. The Yoruba had sacrificed a rooster to honor Ogun, the god of iron, letting its blood spill on the forge. The Igbo, unfamiliar with this ritual, whispered uneasily. One muttered that perhaps the Yoruba sought to bind their spirits. The Yoruba, hearing the whispers though not the words, grew defensive. Tension thickened until Adigun stood before them, wiped the blood on his chest, and said firmly in broken Igbo, "Ogun iron friend, not enemy." The gesture calmed the fears, but Obinna realized how fragile their bond still was. Respect required not only curiosity but humility. In time, both sides began to host each other. The Igbo invited Yoruba traders to cross the river and visit their villages. There, the Yoruba marveled at Igbo councils, at women speaking boldly in assemblies, at masquerades that danced with a different energy. The Yoruba offered greetings, though they did not prostrate, and the Igbo smiled at their effort. Likewise, when Igbo traveled deeper into Yoruba towns, they marveled at markets that stretched as far as the eye could see, at walls built from red earth, at kings who sat on thrones of carved wood. Though they did not bow as Yoruba did, they offered kola nuts and songs, which the Yoruba received with open hearts. Step by step, exchange by exchange, culture flowed across the river like trade goods, reshaping both peoples. One evening, as the firelight flickered, Obinna reflected aloud to Okeke. "When we first came, I thought these people strange, their tongues sharp, their ways foreign. But now I see they are men like us. They eat, they trade, they honor gods and elders. Their ways are not our ways, yet their hearts beat as ours do." Okeke smiled, chewing a piece of kola. "The world is wide, Obinna, yet the spirits made us kin. The river does not divide us, it joins us." And under the vast sky, with drums echoing and fire crackling, Obinna believed it. As seasons passed, trade between the Igbo and Yoruba no longer felt like a chance encounter. It became a necessity. Yams, palm oil, beads, iron, and smoked fish crossed the river regularly. What had once been awkward silences and clumsy gestures now turned into laughter, rituals, and most importantly, friendships. Yet one barrier remained stubborn: language. The older men managed with signs and repetition, but for true trust and deeper bonds, words were needed. It was the children who first bridged the gap. The language of children. Obinna often noticed how the little ones played freely without fear of mistakes. Yoruba children would shout, "Iwa, come here," while tugging at Igbo sleeves. Igbo children replied with "Bia, come." Before long, they were running about mixing words, inventing phrases like "Bia wa" or "Ije Iani," strange hybrids that made no sense to their elders but allowed them to chase goats, share roasted maize, and laugh without hesitation. One boy in particular, a Yoruba child named Adebayo, showed a gift. He mimicked words easily and had a sharp ear for tone. When Obinna called, "New welcome," Adebayo would echo it perfectly. Similarly, when Adigun shouted, "Ikero, good morning, young Ifeoma," Okeke's granddaughter, repeated it until her tongue curled just right. The elders watched with amusement and quiet awe. "These little ones," Okeke muttered, "will build a bridge stronger than any canoe." The rise of interpreters. Before long, Adebayo and Ifeoma became the first mediators. During trade, they stood between adults, translating as best as their young tongues allowed. One day, a dispute arose over iron hose. A Yoruba smith claimed he had delivered 10 pieces, but Obinna insisted he received only 8. The men grew agitated, hands gesturing sharply. Just when it seemed tempers would flare, Adebayo stepped forward. In broken Igbo, he said, "Baba say 10. Obinna say 8. Then in Yoruba, he repeated the matter. The simple translation slowed the anger. Both sides counted the tools again, and sure enough, 2 hoes had been left in the corner of the forge unnoticed. The quarrel dissolved into laughter, and Adebayo beamed as if he had ended a war. From then on, whenever disputes arose, children like Adebayo and Ifeoma were called to stand between elders. With every word they learned, trust deepened. Friendship across tongues. It was not only children who tried. Obinna himself began collecting Yoruba words the way one might collect cowries. He repeated after Adigun, stumbling at first but improving with each attempt. He learned to say, "Oyun, thank you," and Ikabo, welcome. Adigun, in return, learned to say Emila, thank you, in Igbo. The first time Adigun used it, offering Obinna a calabash of palm wine, Obinna's eyes widened in delight. He clapped his hands and exclaimed, "You are learning, my brother." For Obinna, every word learned was more than sound. It was a doorway into Adigun's heart. And when Adigun managed to mimic Igbo proverbs Uni nor Nwa nor Aichi, he who has a child has wealth, everyone roared with approval. The first Yoruba in Igbo land. With trust growing, an invitation was extended across the river. One dry season, Obinna urged Adigun to visit his Igbo village. At first, Adigun hesitated. Leaving the safety of his town to walk among strangers was no small matter. But Obinna's sincerity convinced him. When Adigun finally crossed into Igbo land, the villagers gathered in curiosity. Children peeked from behind huts. Women paused their pounding to stare at his beaded armlets and different attire. Some elders whispered nervously, could they trust an outsider? Okeke, however, stepped forward, held out kola nuts, and said, "New welcome." Obinna whispered the meaning to Adigun, who bowed slightly and accepted. That night, the Igbo hosted him with music, roasted yam, and palm wine. Adigun marveled at their masquerades, the boldness of Igbo women who sang loudly alongside men, and the laughter that filled the air. Though he understood little, the warmth was unmistakable. When he returned home, he carried not only goods but stories of Igbo generosity, of kola nut rituals, of new ways to think about community. A Yoruba girl in Igbo songs. In time, the exchange grew more personal. Among the Igbo traders, a young man named Namdi grew fond of a Yoruba girl named Abike. Their meetings at the market were innocent at first, shared smiles, helping hands when baskets spilled, but soon, songs began to follow. The Igbo teased Namdi with a tune. Okuko hiru Abike, ogagi iku akpo. The cock that sees a bike must crow. Though the words were Igbo, the name Abike rang out clearly. The Yoruba laughed when they understood, and soon their drummers wove Abike's name into rhythms at gatherings. Though marriage between the two groups was not yet common, the seeds of affection had been planted. Religious curiosity. Even in matters of spirit, the mediators played a role. Yoruba priests invited Igbo men to witness rituals for Ogun, showing how iron was consecrated before use. In turn, Igbo priests explained the importance of Ani, the earth goddess, who must be honored before planting yams. At first, explanations were clumsy, but children like Ifeoma translated what little they could. The Yoruba nodded when they heard of Ani's role, saying she was not unlike their goddess, Anile. The Igbo nodded in return, saying Ogun's reverence for iron echoed their own respect for the blacksmith. Though each people held firmly to their ways, they began to sense a thread of similarity weaving between their worlds. Challenges of trust. Not all encounters were smooth. One season, a Yoruba man accused an Igbo trader of cheating with false weights for cowries. The matter escalated quickly, and rumors spread of betrayal. Some called for ending the trade altogether. But this time, it was the mediators who stepped in, not just children but adults who had learned both tongues. Obinna himself spoke Yoruba enough to plead. "We do not cheat. Let us weigh again before all." Under watchful eyes, the cowries were measured anew, and the misunderstanding cleared. The Yoruba man, embarrassed, offered restitution, and peace was restored. It was a dangerous moment, but it showed how far they had come. Without shared words, suspicion might have broken the fragile bond. With words, healing was possible. The gift of Proverbs. One evening, Okeke sat with Yoruba elders under the moonlight. Through the help of Adebayo, now nearly a young man, they exchanged proverbs. The Yoruba elder said, "By Omo Bamoi, Akewi Funaun, if a child knows how to wash his hands, he will eat with elders." Okeke nodded, smiling, and replied, "Okuko adigi eshifu unik poroya enoku, a fowl does not forget the one who roasted it." Laughter rippled as each proverb was explained. Though the words were foreign, the wisdom was shared, and respect grew deeper. The dawn of a new future. By the end of that season, the Igbo and Yoruba no longer looked at each other as strange foreigners. They were neighbors, friends, and even kin in trade. Interpreters, once just playful children, became essential voices of peace. Leaders on both sides began to dream of more than trade. They imagined lasting bonds, perhaps even alliances in times of war. For Obinna, the journey was personal. He had come across the river wary, suspicious of men whose tongues sounded harsh and foreign. Now he sat by the fire with Adigun, sharing palm wine, speaking in a mixture of Yoruba and Igbo that made them both laugh. "When we first met," Obinna said haltingly in Yoruba, "I thought you enemy." Adigun grinned and replied in clumsy Igbo, "Now you my brother." The two men clinked calabashes together, sealing not just a friendship, but a new chapter in the history of their peoples. The river that once divided the Igbo and Yoruba had become a lifeline, not of water alone but of friendship. What began with stares of suspicion and awkward gestures had ripened into laughter, shared rituals, and even kinship. By now, seasons had passed, children had grown taller, and both peoples had changed in ways they had never imagined. A marriage across the river. The first true seal of unity came in the form of a marriage. Namdi, the Igbo youth once teased for his fondness for a bike, did not let his affection fade with time. Each market day, he found a way to stand by her stall, to help carry her goods, to share roasted yam or maize. Slowly, her family began to notice, and so did his. At first, there was resistance. Some Igbo elders muttered, "How can he bring a Yoruba woman into our lineage?" And on the other side, Yoruba women whispered, "Will a bike not be lost in a foreign tongue?" But love has a way of silencing doubts. With interpreters bridging the discussions, families sat together, speaking with caution but also with hope. Gifts were exchanged. Yams and palm oil from the Igbo, cloth and beads from the Yoruba. When the wedding finally took place, it was unlike anything the river had seen before. Igbo drummers and Yoruba talking drums played side by side. Women ululated in Igbo and sang praise songs in Yoruba. The bride was adorned in beads and wrappers from both cultures, her hair styled half in Igbo fashion, half in Yoruba. It was not just a marriage of two people, but of two worlds. When Namdi held a bike's hand before the gathered crowd, Obinna whispered to Okeke, "The river cannot divide us any longer." Shared rituals and blended customs. After the marriage, customs began to mix more freely. Yoruba men began to chew kola nut at Igbo gatherings, while Igbo visitors offered palm wine during Yoruba ceremonies. Festivals also began to reflect the bond. During a Yoruba masquerade, Igbo traders were invited to dance in their own style. During the Igbo New Yam Festival, Yoruba guests were honored with the first slices. Though the languages still carried differences, the shared food, music, and laughter built a new common ground. One remarkable moment came during a thunderstorm. As lightning cracked across the sky, Yoruba men shouted, "Sango," while Igbo men cried, "Amadioha." But instead of confusion, they laughed, clasping hands. "Two names," Adigun said with a grin, "one thunder." The rise of a common market. Trade, too, transformed. What began as simple bartering expanded into a full market, held at the riverbank every 4 days. Canoes lined the shore, loaded with goods. Igbo and Yoruba sellers shouted in mixed tongues, blending words as easily as they blended prices. Over time, a pigeon of sorts emerged, a language not fully Igbo, not fully Yoruba, but enough for trade and laughter. Words like biawa and jenri, kamit, were tossed around with ease. The market became famous, drawing even strangers from other lands who marveled at the unity of two once distant peoples. Trials that tested the bond. But unity was not without trials. One year, a drought struck. Yams withered in Igbo farms, and streams dried up in Yoruba towns. Hunger gnawed at both sides, and suspicion threatened to return. Some Igbo whispered that the Yoruba had angered the gods. Some Yoruba murmured that the Igbo had cursed the land. It was in this moment of crisis that the elders acted. Okeke, frail but wise, called for a joint gathering. "Let us sacrifice not apart, but together," he declared. And so, for the first time, Yoruba priests and Igbo priests stood side by side. They poured libations to Chukwu and Olajimere, to Ani and Onile, to Amadioha and Sango. Drums beat in unison as prayers rose to the heavens. When rains finally returned weeks later, both sides claimed it was the unity of prayer that touched the gods. From then on, joint rituals became a sign of peace, performed whenever disputes or disasters threatened harmony. The birth of a new generation. The children born of these unions became living symbols of unity. Nnamdi and Abike's first son was named Chukwuyemi, a blend of Igbo Chukwu, God, and Yoruba Yemi, befitting me. Other families followed suit, choosing names that honored both tongues. These children grew up switching easily between languages, moving freely across the river, comfortable in both worlds. They were the true mediators, no longer needing interpreters. For them, Igbo and Yoruba were not foreign but familiar, two sides of the same coin. As they grew, they carried stories of their ancestors' first awkward meetings, told now with amusement rather than fear. "Once," Adebayo would laugh, "your grandfather thought we were spirits because we painted our faces at festivals." And Ifeoma would reply, "And yours thought we had no leaders because we all argued together." The children laughed, not with mockery but with pride at how far their people had come. Legacy of the elders. As age weighed heavily on Okeke, he called Obinna and Adigun to his side. With trembling hands, he held out a kola nut, broke it, and gave each man a piece. "When we first came," he said softly, "we feared each other. Now you sit as brothers. Guard this bond, for it is more precious than gold or cowries. Rivers can divide, but they can also join. Never forget." Not long after, Okeke passed into the world of the ancestors. At his burial, Yoruba guests crossed the river to mourn with the Igbo. Drummers from both sides played, their rhythms weaving into a single song. It was the first burial jointly honored by both peoples, a final proof that unity was no longer fragile, it was rooted like the Irako tree. The vision ahead. As moons turned into years, the story of the Igbo and Yoruba meeting for the first time became a tale told around firesides. The young listened wide-eyed as elders described how no one had understood each other at first, how silence, suspicion, and confusion nearly drove them apart. But then came trade, festivals, interpreters, marriage, and shared rituals. The story always ended with the same lesson. The tongue may be different, but the heart knows its own kin. Obinna, now gray-haired, would often sit by the river with Adigun, both men content in silence. They no longer needed interpreters, not because they had mastered each other's languages fully, but because friendship had taught them something deeper than words. Looking at the children playing by the river, their laughter echoing in both tongues, Obinna thought, perhaps one day, there will be no Igbo or Yoruba here, only one people bound by this river. And with that thought, the bond was sealed not by kings or wars, but by the quiet persistence of trade, curiosity, and friendship. Summary. The story traces the first encounters between the Igbo and Yoruba peoples, beginning with suspicion and silence when neither understood the other's language. Early meetings at the riverbank were tense, filled with gestures and misinterpretations, but necessity drove them to exchange goods like yams, fish, beads, and iron. Over time, trust grew. In Chapter 2, trade expanded and curiosity replaced fear. By Chapter 3, the two sides began marveling at each other's customs, festivals, rituals, and leadership styles, though differences sometimes caused confusion. Cultural exchanges deepened in Chapter 4, as the Igbo were invited to Yoruba masquerades, while the Yoruba learned the Igbo kola nut rituals. Respect for each other's gods and traditions slowly developed. Chapter 5 marked a turning point. Children like Adebayo and Ifeoma became natural interpreters, blending languages and resolving disputes. Friendships blossomed, visits across the river began, and even romantic ties emerged, especially between Nnamdi and Abike. If you enjoyed our video, please share your thoughts about the tale of the first time the Igbo people met the Yoruba people in the comments. Please take a moment to follow and subscribe to our channel to stay updated on our upcoming stories. Thank you.